The morning of October 23, 1920, dawned crisp and clear in the small town of Millbrook, Pennsylvania, with the kind of golden autumn sunlight that seemed to promise perfect happiness for young couples beginning their lives together. Eleanor Marie Whitfield stood before the full-length mirror in her childhood bedroom, adjusting the delicate Belgian lace veil that had belonged to her grandmother and her great-grandmother before her. The veil, with its intricate patterns of roses and lilies worked by hand over a century ago, was the most precious heirloom of the Whitfield family, passed down through generations of brides who had worn it on the happiest days of their lives. Eleanor herself was a vision of early 20th century bridal perfection. At 22 years old, she possessed the kind of natural beauty that needed no artifice. Dark chestnut hair arranged in the fashionable Gibson girl style of the era, expressive brown eyes that sparkled with intelligence and warmth, and a complexion that glowed with the health and vitality of youth. Her wedding dress, ordered specially from Philadelphia at considerable expense to her father, was crafted from the finest ivory silk, with pearl buttons running from the high neckline to the fitted waist, and a train that would sweep elegantly behind her as she walked down the aisle of St. Mary's Episcopal Church. The groom-to-be, Jonathan Hartwell, was a young lawyer who had recently established his practice in the neighboring town of Riverside. At 26, he was considered an excellent catch. Handsome, educated, ambitious, and from a well-respected family with connections throughout the state. The courtship between Eleanor and Jonathan had been brief but intense, with the couple meeting at a county fair in the spring and becoming engaged by midsummer. Their wedding was to be the social event of the season in Millbrook, with guests traveling from as far as Pittsburgh to attend the ceremony and reception. The Whitfield family had spared no expense in preparing for their eldest daughter's wedding. The family's Victorian mansion on Elm Street had been transformed into a bower of autumn flowers. Chrysanthemums, dahlias, and late-blooming roses filled every room, their fragrances mingling with the scent of beeswax candles and polished wood. The wedding breakfast was to be an elaborate affair, with tables set for over 100 guests in the grand ballroom that occupied the entire second floor of the mansion. Eleanor's father, Charles Whitfield, was one of Millbrook's most prominent citizens, having built a successful lumber business that supplied materials for construction projects throughout western Pennsylvania. Her mother, Margaret, was a pillar of local society, known for her charitable works and her skill as a hostess. The family's social position meant that Eleanor's wedding would be reported in newspapers as far away as Philadelphia and New York, with detailed descriptions of her dress, the decorations, and the distinguished guest list. As Eleanor made her final preparations on that fateful morning, everything seemed perfect. Her bridesmaids, her younger sister Catherine, and 3 close friends from finishing school had arrived early to help with the elaborate process of arranging her dress and veil. The photographer, Mr. Samuel Morrison, had already taken several portraits of the bride in the morning light, streaming through her bedroom windows. These photographs, intended to be treasured keepsakes of the happiest day of her life, would instead become the last documented images of Eleanor Marie Whitfield. The ceremony was scheduled for 2 o'clock in the afternoon, with the wedding breakfast to follow immediately afterward. At 11 o'clock that morning, Eleanor had been in high spirits, laughing with her bridesmaids and expressing her excitement about beginning her new life as Mrs. Jonathan Hartwell. She had eaten a light breakfast and spent time reviewing the receiving line arrangements with her mother, showing no signs of nervousness or second thoughts about the approaching ceremony. At approximately 11:30, Eleanor excused herself to have a few moments alone, telling her mother that she wanted to write a brief note to her grandmother, who was too frail to travel from Boston for the wedding. She retreated to the small writing desk in her bedroom, dismissing her bridesmaids with the promise that she would call for them when she was ready to put on her veil for the final time. Those were the last words Eleanor Marie Whitfield would ever speak to her family. When Catherine knocked on her sister's bedroom door at 12:15 to remind her that the photographer wanted to take additional portraits before leaving for the church, there was no response. Assuming that Eleanor had perhaps dozed off from pre-wedding exhaustion, Catherine quietly opened the door to check on her sister. The room was empty. Eleanor's wedding dress lay carefully spread across the bed, apparently removed and arranged with the same care that had been taken in putting it on. Her shoes were placed neatly beside the bed, and her jewelry, a pearl necklace and earrings that were to be her something old, was arranged precisely on the dressing table. The room showed no signs of struggle or haste, but rather appeared as if Eleanor had simply decided to undress and had then vanished into thin air. Most mysteriously of all, her precious family veil was draped carefully over the chair at her writing desk, positioned as if she had just removed it and intended to put it back on momentarily. The veil was undamaged and showed no signs that it had been handled roughly or removed in haste. On the writing desk itself, there was no sign of the note Eleanor had mentioned writing to her grandmother. No paper, no pen, no indication that she had actually begun to write anything at all. The initial search was conducted quietly, with family members checking every room in the large house, while the bridesmaids searched the extensive gardens surrounding the property. Charles Whitfield examined the doors and windows, looking for any sign that Eleanor might have left the house, but found nothing out of place. All entrances were secure, and there were no footprints or other traces that might indicate the route of her departure. As the afternoon wore on, and the time for the ceremony approached, the family was forced to acknowledge that something was seriously wrong. Jonathan Hartwell arrived at the church with his groomsmen, expecting to find his bride waiting with her family. Instead, he was met by Charles Whitfield, who took him aside to explain that Eleanor had disappeared and that the wedding would need to be postponed while they searched for her. The news spread quickly through the assembled wedding guests, creating a sensation that would be talked about for years to come. Many of the visitors were from out of town and had traveled considerable distances to attend the ceremony. The sudden cancellation, under such mysterious circumstances, transformed what should have been a joyful celebration into a source of gossip and speculation that reached far beyond the borders of Millbrook. Local law enforcement was called in by evening, when it became clear that Eleanor had not simply stepped out for a walk or gone to visit a friend without telling anyone. Sheriff William Hayes, a practical man with over 20 years of experience in rural law enforcement, initially suspected that the bride had developed cold feet and had run off to avoid the wedding. Such cases, while embarrassing to the families involved, were not unheard of and usually resolved themselves within a few days when the missing person returned home or sent word of their whereabouts. However, as the investigation progressed, Sheriff Hayes became increasingly puzzled by the circumstances of Eleanor's disappearance. Unlike typical cases of pre-wedding anxiety, there was no evidence that Eleanor had planned her departure in advance. Her personal belongings were all accounted for, including money, jewelry, and clothing that she would have needed if she intended to travel. Her favorite horse remained in the stable, and no one in town had seen her walking or riding away from the house. More importantly, everyone who had spoken with Eleanor that morning insisted that she had shown no signs of reluctance about the wedding. Her bridesmaids described her as excited and happy, looking forward to the ceremony and her future with Jonathan. Her mother confirmed that Eleanor had been enthusiastic about all the wedding preparations and had expressed no doubts about her choice of husband or her readiness for marriage. The search expanded to include neighboring towns and cities, with law enforcement officers throughout the region alerted to watch for a young woman matching Eleanor's description. Jonathan Hartwell posted a substantial reward for information leading to his fiancée's safe return, and the story was picked up by newspapers throughout Pennsylvania and the surrounding states. Despite these efforts, no trace of Eleanor was ever found. No witness came forward to report seeing her after that morning in her bedroom. No evidence was discovered to suggest foul play, accident, or intentional disappearance. Eleanor Marie Whitfield had simply vanished as completely as if she had never existed, leaving behind only her wedding dress, her veil, and a mystery that would haunt her family and community for generations to come. The Whitfield family never recovered from the loss. Margaret Whitfield retreated into semi-seclusion, rarely leaving the house and gradually withdrawing from the social activities that had once defined her life. Charles struggled to maintain his business interests while dealing with the constant speculation and whispered theories about his daughter's fate. Catherine, deeply affected by the loss of her beloved sister, never married and devoted herself to caring for her increasingly fragile parents. Jonathan Hartwell left Millbrook within a month of the disappearance, unable to bear the constant reminders of his lost love and the pitying looks of townspeople who had witnessed his public humiliation. He eventually established a new law practice in Chicago, but according to those who knew him, he never fully recovered from Eleanor's loss and remained a bachelor for the rest of his life. The Whitfield mansion on Elm Street became something of a local landmark, not for its architectural beauty or historical significance, but as the site of one of Pennsylvania's most enduring, unsolved mysteries. Visitors to Millbrook would often drive past the house, hoping to catch a glimpse of some clue that might explain what had happened to the vanished bride. Over the years, the property developed a reputation for being haunted, with neighbors reporting strange lights in Eleanor's former bedroom and the occasional sound of wedding bells ringing when no church service was taking place. The case remained officially open for decades, with each new sheriff inheriting the file and occasionally reviewing the evidence in hopes of finding some overlooked clue. However, as the years passed and the original witnesses aged and died, the investigation gradually shifted from an active case to a historical curiosity. By the 1950s, Eleanor's disappearance had become local folklore, the subject of ghost stories and speculation rather than serious law enforcement inquiry. It was not until 2024, more than a century after Eleanor's vanishing, that new evidence would emerge to shed light on this enduring mystery. Dr. Marcus Brennan, a forensic genealogist specializing in cold cases, was conducting research into unsolved disappearances from the early 20th century when he came across the Whitfield case in the Pennsylvania State Archives. Intrigued by the unusual circumstances and the complete lack of resolution, Dr. Brennan decided to apply modern investigative techniques to see if any new insights could be gained from the century-old evidence. Dr. Brennan's approach differed significantly from traditional historical research. Rather than focusing solely on the immediate circumstances of Eleanor's disappearance, he used genealogical databases, newspaper archives, and photographic collections to create a comprehensive picture of life in Pennsylvania during the 1920s. His goal was to identify any patterns or connections that might have been missed by investigators who lacked access to the vast amounts of digitized historical information now available. One of Dr. Brennan's most valuable resources was the Pennsylvania Historical Society's extensive collection of photographs from the early 20th century. The Society had recently completed a massive digitization project, scanning thousands of photographs from small-town newspapers, family collections, and professional photographers' archives. These images provided an unprecedented visual record of daily life, social events, and community activities throughout the state during the period surrounding Eleanor's disappearance. It was while examining these digitized photographs that Dr. Brennan made a discovery that would challenge everything that was thought to be known about the Eleanor Whitfield case. Among the images was a photograph taken by a newspaper photographer in the city of Allentown, Pennsylvania, on November 15, 1925, exactly 5 years and 3 weeks after Eleanor's disappearance. The photograph documented a funeral procession for a prominent local businessman, with crowds of mourners lining the streets to pay their respects. The image itself was unremarkable, a typical example of local newspaper photography from the period, showing the horse-drawn hearse proceeding slowly down a tree-lined street while townspeople watched from the sidewalks. However, when Dr. Brennan applied digital enhancement techniques to examine the crowd more closely, he discovered something that seemed impossible. Standing among the mourners on the right side of the street, partially obscured by the shadows cast by an elm tree, was a figure that bore an unmistakable resemblance to Eleanor Whitfield. The woman in the photograph was dressed in the dark clothing appropriate for a funeral, with her face partially veiled, but her posture, height, and visible facial features were consistent with the missing bride. Most remarkable was the expression captured in the photograph. While the other mourners showed the solemn demeanor expected at a funeral, the figure identified as Eleanor appeared to be looking directly at the camera with an expression that seemed to convey both recognition and a desperate desire to communicate. Her eyes, though partially shadowed, seemed to hold an intensity that set her apart from the other people in the crowd. Dr. Brennan's initial reaction was professional skepticism. He had encountered numerous cases where family members or investigators thought they had spotted missing persons in unrelated photographs, only to discover that wishful thinking or coincidental resemblance had created the illusion of a match. However, as he applied increasingly sophisticated facial recognition software to compare the funeral photograph with the known images of Eleanor Whitfield, the similarities became impossible to ignore. The software analysis indicated a high probability that the two faces belonged to the same person, despite the 5-year gap between Eleanor's disappearance and the funeral photograph. The bone structure, eye spacing, nose shape, and jawline all matched within acceptable parameters for positive identification. Even more convincing were certain unique characteristics. A small scar above Eleanor's left eyebrow, visible in her wedding portraits, appeared to be present in the funeral photograph as well. However, the implications of this identification were deeply troubling. If Eleanor Whitfield had been alive and present at a funeral in Allentown in 1925, why had she never contacted her family or returned to Millbrook? What could have caused her to abandon her previous life so completely that she would attend public events in a neighboring city without fear of recognition? Dr. Brennan expanded his research to include the specific funeral documented in the photograph. The deceased was Hamilton Graves, a wealthy manufacturer who had owned several textile mills in the Allentown area. Graves had died of a heart attack at the age of 58, leaving behind a widow and 3 adult children. The funeral had been one of the largest social events in Allentown that year, with mourners including business leaders, politicians, and prominent families from throughout the region. Most significantly, Dr. Brennan discovered that Hamilton Graves had extensive business connections throughout Pennsylvania, including several partnerships with lumber companies in the western part of the state. This raised the possibility that Graves might have had some connection to Eleanor's father, Charles Whitfield, though no direct evidence of such a relationship could be found in the surviving business records. As Dr. Brennan delved deeper into the Graves family history, he uncovered information that added another layer of mystery to the case. Hamilton Graves had married his wife, Victoria, in 1889, but the couple had experienced several tragic losses over the years. They had lost 2 infant children to disease in the 1890s, and their eldest son had been killed in France during World War I. The family had also suffered financial setbacks in the early 1920s, with several of Graves' business ventures failing due to post-war economic instability. More intriguingly, Dr. Brennan found evidence that the Graves household had employed several young women as companions and assistants to Mrs. Victoria Graves, who had suffered from poor health and depression following her son's death in the war. These positions were typically filled by well-educated women from respectable families who had fallen on hard times, and the arrangements were often made through informal networks of wealthy families throughout the state. The possibility began to emerge that Eleanor Whitfield might have somehow become connected to the Graves household following her disappearance, perhaps taking on a new identity and serving as a companion to the grieving widow. This would explain her presence at Hamilton Graves's funeral, as household employees would have been expected to attend such events as a mark of respect for their employer. However, this theory raised as many questions as it answered. How had Eleanor made her way from Millbrook to Allentown? Why had she chosen to abandon her previous life rather than simply postponing the wedding if she was having doubts? Most importantly, why had she never contacted her family to let them know she was alive and well? Dr. Brennan's research into the Graves family servants and employees proved challenging, as many of the relevant records had been lost or destroyed over the intervening century. However, he was able to locate several letters and diary entries from family friends and business associates that mentioned the household staff during the period in question. One particularly revealing document was a letter written by Victoria Graves to her sister in Philadelphia, dated March 1921. In the letter, Mrs. Graves mentioned that she had recently hired a new companion, a young woman of good family, who had experienced some kind of personal tragedy and needed to start her life over in new surroundings. The letter described the companion as intelligent, well-educated, and remarkably beautiful, but also noted that she seemed haunted by some unnamed sorrow and rarely spoke of her past. Most significantly, the letter mentioned that the new companion had arrived with nothing but the clothes she wore, claiming that her previous belongings had been lost in a fire. Mrs. Graves had taken pity on the young woman and had provided her with a complete new wardrobe, as well as a small room in the servants' quarters of the family mansion. While the letter did not mention the companion's name, it did include a physical description that matched Eleanor Whitfield in several key details. The woman was described as being of medium height, with dark hair and brown eyes, and possessing the kind of refined mannerisms that indicated a privileged upbringing. She was also noted to be particularly skilled at needlework and embroidery, talents that Eleanor had developed during her finishing school education. Dr. Brennan attempted to locate additional information about this mysterious companion through church records, census data, and other official documents from the Allentown area. However, He found that many records from the early 1920s had been damaged or destroyed over the years, making it impossible to verify the woman's identity through conventional means. The investigation took on new urgency when Dr. Brennan discovered additional photographs from the Graves family collection that had been donated to the Allentown Historical Society. These images, taken at various family and social events between 1921 and 1925, showed several household employees and companions, including a young woman whose resemblance to Eleanor Whitfield was even more striking than the figure in the funeral photograph. In these images, the woman was shown participating in various household activities, helping to arrange flowers for a dinner party, assisting with charitable work for the local church, and standing with other servants during a formal family portrait. In each photograph, she appeared healthy and well cared for, but there was something in her expression that suggested deep sadness or regret. Most remarkable was a photograph taken during Christmas celebrations in 1923, which showed the woman decorating a Christmas tree in the Graves family parlor. She was wearing an elegant dark dress and appeared to be laughing at something outside the frame of the photograph. However, when Dr. Brennan enhanced the image using digital techniques, he could see that the laughter did not extend to her eyes, which held an expression of profound melancholy. The enhanced analysis also revealed another detail that seemed to confirm the woman's identity. Around her neck, barely visible beneath the high collar of her dress, was what appeared to be a small gold locket. Eleanor Whitfield had owned a similar locket, a confirmation gift from her grandmother, that contained a photograph of her parents. If this was indeed the same piece of jewelry, it would provide strong evidence that the woman in the Graves household was Eleanor herself. As Dr. Brennan continued his investigation, he began to develop a theory about what might have happened to Eleanor on her wedding day in 1920. Rather than being the victim of foul play or accident, Eleanor might have deliberately vanished in order to escape some situation or obligation that had become unbearable to her. The carefully arranged bedroom, with her wedding dress laid out and her veil draped over the chair, suggested someone who had made a deliberate choice rather than someone who had been forced to leave against their will. This theory was supported by additional research into the social and family dynamics surrounding Eleanor's wedding. Dr. Brennan discovered that the match between Eleanor and Jonathan Hartwell had been largely arranged by their parents, who saw the union as advantageous for both families' business and social interests. While Eleanor had appeared happy about the engagement, contemporary letters and diary entries suggested that she had expressed private concerns about her readiness for marriage and her compatibility with her intended husband. More troubling were hints that Eleanor might have been involved with someone else entirely. Several references in family letters mentioned Eleanor's friendship with a young man named Michael O'Sullivan, the son of Irish immigrants who worked as a clerk in her father's lumber business. The friendship had apparently caused some concern among Eleanor's family members, who felt that Michael's social position made him an unsuitable companion for a young woman of Eleanor's standing. Dr. Brennan found evidence that Charles Whitfield had explicitly forbidden Eleanor from continuing her friendship with Michael and had made arrangements for the young man to be transferred to a lumber operation in Oregon, effectively removing him from Eleanor's life just months before her engagement to Jonathan Hartwell was announced. The possibility emerged that Eleanor's disappearance might have been connected to her feelings for Michael O'Sullivan and her despair at being forced to marry a man she did not love while the person she cared for was sent away. However, Dr. Brennan's attempts to trace Michael's fate proved unsuccessful, as immigration and employment records from the period were incomplete and often unreliable. What Dr. Brennan did discover was that several young women from prominent families during this era had faced similar conflicts between family expectations and personal desires, and a few had chosen to disappear rather than submit to marriages they did not want. These cases typically involved the woman taking on a new identity and finding employment in a different city, often with the help of sympathetic friends or charitable organizations that assisted women in difficult circumstances. The more Dr. Brennan learned about the social pressures faced by young women of Eleanor's class during the 1920s, the more plausible her voluntary disappearance became. Women who refused to comply with family expectations about marriage often found themselves completely cut off from financial support and social connections, making it necessary for them to reinvent themselves entirely if they wanted to survive independently. This context helped explain why Eleanor might have chosen to become a companion in the Graves household, rather than seeking help from her own family or friends. By taking on a position that provided room, board, and respectability, while allowing her to maintain her anonymity, she could have created a new life for herself without having to return to the situation she had fled. However, the psychological cost of such a decision would have been enormous. Eleanor would have been forced to abandon not only her family and fiancé, but also her entire identity and social position. The sadness visible in her expression in the later photographs might have reflected her ongoing grief for the life she had given up, even as she found some measure of peace in her new circumstances. Dr. Brennan's research also revealed that Eleanor's story, if his theory was correct, would not have had a happy ending. Records from the Allentown area showed that the woman believed to be Eleanor had died in early 1926, less than a year after Hamilton Graves's funeral. The death certificate listed the cause as pneumonia, but also noted that the deceased had been in declining health for several months prior to her death. Most poignantly, the death certificate listed the woman's name as Ellen Whitmore, a variation that was close enough to her real name to suggest she had maintained some connection to her original identity, while being different enough to prevent easy recognition by anyone who might have known her as Eleanor Whitfield. The funeral records showed that Ellen Whitmore had been buried in Allentown's Greenwood Cemetery, with Victoria Graves paying for a modest headstone and funeral service. The grave had apparently been visited regularly by Mrs. Graves until her own death in 1934, but had been neglected thereafter, and was now difficult to locate among the thousands of graves in the large cemetery. Dr. Brennan made arrangements to visit Greenwood Cemetery and attempt to locate Eleanor's grave, hoping that the headstone might provide additional clues about her life and death. With the help of cemetery records and ground-penetrating radar, he was eventually able to identify the burial site, though the original headstone had deteriorated badly and was barely readable. However, the gravesite did yield one final piece of evidence that seemed to confirm Eleanor's identity. Buried with her personal effects was the gold locket that had been glimpsed in the Christmas photograph from 1923. When the locket was carefully opened by conservation specialists, it revealed two photographs, one showing Charles and Margaret Whitfield, Eleanor's parents, and the other showing a young man who matched contemporary descriptions of Michael O'Sullivan. The discovery of the locket provided the final confirmation that Dr. Brennan needed to establish that Eleanor Whitfield had indeed survived her wedding day disappearance and had lived for several years under an assumed identity in Allentown. The presence of Michael O'Sullivan's photograph in the locket suggested that her feelings for him had played a central role in her decision to abandon her previous life, and that she had carried those feelings with her until her death. Armed with this evidence, Dr. Brennan contacted the surviving members of the Whitfield family to share his discoveries. Eleanor's great-niece, Patricia Whitfield Morrison, had inherited the family home in Millbrook and had maintained an interest in solving the mystery that had haunted her family for generations. When Dr. Brennan presented his findings, including the enhanced photographs and the evidence from Eleanor's grave, Patricia was deeply moved to finally learn what had become of her legendary ancestor. The revelation that Eleanor had been alive for 6 years after her disappearance but had chosen never to contact her family was both heartbreaking and somehow comforting. The family had always wondered whether she had met with foul play or had suffered some terrible accident, and learning that she had been safe and had made her own choice about her future provided a measure of closure that they had never expected to achieve. Patricia Morrison arranged for Eleanor's remains to be exhumed from Greenwood Cemetery and reinterred in the Whitfield family plot in Millbrook, where she was finally laid to rest beside the parents who had spent decades wondering what had become of their beloved daughter. The ceremony was attended by dozens of local residents, many of whom were descendants of families who had known Eleanor during her youth. The headstone placed on Eleanor's new grave bore her real name and the dates of her birth and death, along with an inscription that read, "Eleanor Marie Whitfield, beloved daughter and sister, she chose her own path." The inscription acknowledged both the family's love for Eleanor and their acceptance of the choices she had made, even though those choices had caused them tremendous pain. Dr. Brennan's investigation also led to new information about the fate of Michael O'Sullivan, the young man whose photograph Eleanor had carried in her locket until her death. Research into Oregon Lumber Company records revealed that Michael had indeed worked in the Pacific Northwest for several years after leaving Pennsylvania, but had been killed in a logging accident in 1924, just 2 years before Eleanor's own death. The timing suggested that Eleanor might have learned of Michael's death, and that this news might have contributed to her declining health during her final months, having given up everything for a love that she could never pursue, only to learn that the object of that love was gone forever, would have been a devastating blow that might have weakened her will to live. The complete story of Eleanor Whitfield's disappearance and the years that followed revealed a tragedy of love, sacrifice, and the rigid social expectations that shaped women's lives during the early 20th century. Eleanor had chosen freedom over security, love over duty, but had paid an enormous price for that choice. She had gained the right to live according to her own values, but had lost her family, her identity, and ultimately, the man for whom she had sacrificed everything. The photographs that documented Eleanor's presence in Allentown served as both evidence of her survival and testament to the sadness that had marked her later years. The woman captured in those images had found a kind of peace in her new life, but had never fully recovered from the losses she had endured. Her face in the funeral photograph from 1925 showed someone who had learned to bear great sorrow with dignity, but who had never stopped mourning for what might have been. Dr. Brennan's investigation brought national attention to Eleanor's story, with several newspapers and magazines featuring articles about the vanished bride who had been found more than a century after her disappearance. The case became a symbol of the difficult choices faced by women of Eleanor's generation, caught between traditional expectations and their own desires for independence and autonomy. The story also highlighted the power of modern technology to solve historical mysteries that had seemed impossible to resolve. Without digital enhancement techniques and facial recognition software, the connection between the missing bride and the mysterious woman in the funeral photograph would never have been discovered. Eleanor's identity would have remained hidden forever, leaving her family without the closure they desperately needed. The investigation's success inspired other researchers to apply similar techniques to unsolved disappearances from the early 20th century, leading to several additional cases being resolved through the identification of missing persons in unrelated historical photographs. These discoveries demonstrated that many people who had vanished without a trace had actually continued living under new identities, and that the photographic record of the past might contain evidence of their survival that had simply been waiting for someone with the right tools and knowledge to find it. Eleanor Whitfield's story ultimately became a testament to the complexity of human choice and the enduring power of love to shape our decisions, even when those decisions lead to outcomes we never intended. Her disappearance on her wedding day in 1920 had been an act of desperate courage, a refusal to accept a life that felt like a betrayal of her deepest values. The years that followed had brought both freedom and sorrow, independence and isolation, but had allowed her to remain true to herself until the end of her life. The ghostly figure in the 1925 funeral photograph, standing among strangers in a city far from home, captured the essence of Eleanor's later existence, present but not truly part of the world around her, visible but not truly seen, carrying within herself the secrets of a life that few people would ever understand. She had become a ghost long before her death, haunting the margins of other people's lives while maintaining her own hidden identity. In death, Eleanor finally found the recognition and remembrance that had eluded her in life. Her story served as both a memorial to her courage and a reminder of the human cost of social systems that left women with impossible choices between duty and desire, family and freedom, security and authentic love. The bride who vanished on her wedding day had finally come home, not to the life she had rejected, but to the acknowledgement and understanding that her choices deserved, regardless of their tragic consequences. The 1920 bride had vanished into mystery, but 104 years later, she emerged from the shadows of history as a symbol of the eternal human struggle between the lives we are expected to live and the lives we choose to create for ourselves. Her image in that impossible place, among mourners in a distant city, carrying the secrets of a love that had cost her everything, would forever remind us that even the most carefully planned lives can be transformed by a single moment of courage, and that sometimes the greatest act of love is learning when to let go.